The first time Silas Brooks saw Maude Gentry, she was standing on the roof of her half-finished soddy with a hammer in one hand and a string of profanity that would have made a trail boss blush. And he pulled his horse to a dead stop in the middle of the Kansas plain and forgot, for a full 10 seconds, that he had anywhere else to be. It was the spring of 1874, and the Oklahoma Territory line was close enough to smell on a warm southern wind. But Silas had drifted north into the Kansas grasslands following work, wherever it chose to find him. He had spent the better part of 2 years doing exactly that, picking up fence-stringing jobs here, cattle drives there, sleeping under canvas when the weather permitted and under stars when it did not. He was 28 years old, lean from trail food and honest labor, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of creek water over limestone. He owned a good horse, a Winchester rifle he kept clean, a bedroll, a cast iron skillet, and not much else that mattered. He had told himself on more than one morning that this was the life he preferred. Maude Gentry was 24, and she was proving something to herself and to the flat Kansas horizon and to anyone else who happened to ride by, though she would not have admitted any of that aloud. She had filed her homestead claim under the Homestead Act 2 months prior, 160 acres of short-grass prairie that the land office clerk had tried to talk her out of because she was a woman alone. She had thanked him pleasantly and walked out with her paperwork. Her husband, Thomas Gentry, had died of a fever the previous autumn before they had ever reached Kansas together, before they had ever bought the seed they planned to plant or touched the soil they had dreamed about. She had come anyway, because turning around felt worse than going forward, and because the land was already paid for in Thomas's name and transferred to her own after enough arguing with the right officials. The soddy she was building was her own design, her own labor, supplemented by a neighbor woman named Ruth Calloway who lived 4 miles east and who had lent her a mule for 3 days to help cut the sod bricks. Maude had strong hands, a competent eye for level and square, and a stubbornness that was, in her own private estimation, one of her most useful qualities. She also had, on this particular Tuesday afternoon in late April, a problem with the ridgepole that was making her use language she had learned from the teamsters at the freight depot in St. Louis. Silas would remember later that he did not make any conscious decision to stop his horse. Ramai, the big bay gelding, had simply slowed and then stopped, as though the animal shared his rider's sudden inability to proceed. The woman on the roof of that low earthen building was not beautiful in the way that a painting in a saloon might be beautiful. She was real in a way that paintings were not. Her dark brown hair was pinned up and coming apart, and she had dirt on her cheek and both forearms, and she was fighting that ridgepole with everything she had, and she was losing, and she was furious about it, and something about the totality of her, the fury and the determination and the smear of Kansas earth on her face, lodged itself directly under Silas Brooks's breastbone and stayed there. He would not have approached. He knew better than to ride up, uninvited, on a woman alone in the middle of nowhere. But Maude Gentry looked down from her roof at precisely that moment and saw him, and the ridgepole chose that exact second to slide off the far end of the wall and crash to the ground, and she said, flatly and without particular heat, "I don't suppose you know anything useful about ridgepoles." Silas had helped build 3 soddy houses in the previous 18 months. He dismounted without making a production of it and tied Ramai to a stake she had driven into the ground for exactly that purpose. "Some," he said. "I've said a few." She looked at him from the roof, assessing. Her eyes were gray, which he had not expected, and direct in a way that he found immediately clarifying, as though they cut through whatever performance a person might be inclined to put on. "You're not from the Calloway place," she said. "No, ma'am, I'm traveling through." Silas Brooks. He kept his distance, standing near Ramai because it was the correct thing to do. "Maude Gentry," she said, "I'll pay you for the afternoon if you help me set this pole. I have money." "That's all right," he said. "I said I'll pay," she repeated, and there was something in her voice that told him this was not a negotiation and that her dignity was tied up in it, So he nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am, fair enough," and went to pick up the ridgepole. They worked until the light went amber and long, and in that time she handed him tools with the authority of someone who had planned every step of this and simply needed one more pair of hands. And he followed her lead without question because it was her house, and she clearly knew what she was doing. When the pole was seated and they had laid the first courses of sod on the roof frame to confirm it would hold, she climbed down and paid him 50 cents from a small leather purse she kept in her apron pocket, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," with such finality that he understood he was dismissed. He rode on. He made his camp that night 5 miles southwest of her homestead, near a shallow creek bend that offered good grass for remi and a windbreak from the north. He cooked his supper, cleaned his pan, and told himself firmly that he had work to get to. He had heard there was fence stringing needed up near Abilene. He had a general direction and a general intention and everything he needed to move on in the morning. He was still there the following morning, and the morning after that. He told himself, allowing Remi to rest because the horse had been worked hard. He told himself, waiting to see if the weather would turn, because the clouds in the northwest had a look about them that he did not entirely trust. He told himself many reasonable things that he mostly did not believe. On the fourth day, he was out scouting the creek for the best fishing when he heard a sound that did not belong to the prairie. A dry creak of wood followed by a crash, and then silence. He stood very still, listening. When nothing further came, he saddled Remi and rode northeast toward Maude Gentry's homestead because his feet simply went there before his head had finished debating. He found her in her garden plot, sitting on the ground with her left hand pressed against her right forearm, and a broken section of the wooden fence frame she had been building lying at an angle nearby. She looked up when he rode in, and her expression went through several things quickly: surprise and frustration and something that might briefly have been relief, before settling on the composure she apparently kept in reserve for strangers. "I am fine," she said, before he had dismounted. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and dismounted anyway, because her forearm was bleeding through her fingers. It was a splinter wound, deep and ragged, from the split wood. He had a small kit in his saddlebag, needle and thread and carbolic acid wrapped in oilcloth, because he had been on enough drives to know that wounds left alone in this country became something worse. She allowed him to clean it with the carbolic without much expression, though he could feel the tension in her arm, and she looked at the sky while he worked rather than at what he was doing. "You are still camping nearby," she said. It was not a question. "Creek to the southwest," he said. "Good water." "I know the creek," she said. "It's on my land." He glanced up at that. "I beg your pardon, I didn't know the boundary." "The eastern fork of it is the boundary line," she said. "The western fork isn't. You're on the western fork, I expect." "I am," he said. She said nothing more while he finished the dressing, just the thin strip of clean linen he kept for that purpose. When he was done, she looked at it and said, "Thank you," and then, with slightly less certainty than she usually said anything, "I have coffee on." He had stayed for an hour, sitting on the upturned crate outside her soddy door drinking coffee that was strong and good, and he had not asked her anything personal because it was not his place, and because she had not asked him anything personal, and they had talked instead about the condition of the soil, and whether the spring had been wet enough and what she planned to plant in the garden plot. She knew her farming. She knew it with a precision that told him she had studied it seriously, not just learned it alongside someone else. He had ridden back to his camp that evening with the feeling of a man who had been handed something he had not asked for and did not know what to do with. He moved camp the following week, not to her doorstep. He was not a fool, and he understood the mathematics of a woman alone on the prairie and a strange man and the appearance of things. But he moved the camp closer, settling himself near a limestone outcropping 3 miles from her homestead rather than 5, because 3 miles was easier to cover quickly if something went wrong. This was the reason he told himself, and it was not entirely a lie. In the 4 days since the fence incident, he had noticed other things. A wagon road that ran within half a mile of her property that brought a certain amount of traffic. A man from town who had stopped and whose posture, as Silas had watched from a distance without meaning to, had not sat right with him. Not every traveler on the Kansas plains was honest. He found work because he was not a man to sit idle. A rancher named Phelps, whose spread ran along the south boundary of Maude's homestead land, needed 3 days of post-hole digging, and Silas did it without complaint and got paid fair money, and in the doing of it spent those 3 days near enough to see her smoke rising in the morning and her lamp light in the window at dusk, and neither of those facts was lost on him. He went to her well on the 2nd day of the Phelps work because the rancher's water trough was on the far side of the property, and because he told himself it was practical. Maude was in her garden on her knees in the dirt, and she stood when she heard Remai's hooves, and she wiped her hands on her apron and watched him approach with that gray-eyed directness that he was beginning to understand was simply who she was. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Miss Gentry," he said. "I'm working the Phelps fence line. Wondered if you'd mind me using the well." "I don't mind," she said. "You can call me Maude." He was surprised by that. He did not show it. "Silas," he said. She gave him a nod that settled something between them, a small and quiet formal acknowledgement that they were going to talk to each other like people rather than strangers. Then she said, "The fence on the north side of your section has a rot post. I noticed it from the road. You'll want to warn Phelps." "I'll tell him," Silas said, and drew water for his horse, and thought about the fact that she noticed things and stored them and offered them plainly, without performance. He stayed working for Phelps through the week, and in that time he and Maude had 4 more conversations, 2 at the well. One when she brought a jar of water out to where he was working on the fence line because she had been passing on the road, and it was a hot afternoon. Once when he stopped at her place at the end of a day because he had found a section of her property boundary marker that had been pulled up, possibly by cattle from the Phelps herd wandering, and he thought she should know. She thanked him for the last thing with unusual directness and said, "I'll need to file that with the county office before someone uses it as an excuse to argue the line." He had not thought about it that way, but she was right, and the fact that she thought this way, legally and practically and ahead of whatever was coming, made something in him settle with respect. He was aware, in a way that was becoming impossible to ignore, that he wanted to know everything about her, not just the practical things. He wanted to know what she thought about when the sun went down and the prairie made its nighttime sounds. He wanted to know if she had been happy before Kansas, and if she was happy now, or if happy was even a category she was currently working within. He wanted to know what she had wanted for herself before life had handed her a funeral and a land claim and a hammer, and told her to get on with it. He did not ask any of these things. He was patient by nature and careful by experience, and he understood that whatever was building here was a thing that could not be rushed without being ruined. On a Sunday morning 3 weeks into what he had stopped pretending was a temporary arrangement, Ruth Calloway came calling on Maude with her husband Frank and their 2 children, and Silas had the misfortune of being at Maude's well again when they arrived. Though in his defense, Remai had thrown a shoe, and her place was closest, and he truly had needed the water while he waited for the shoe situation to be resolved. Ruth Calloway was a small woman with an enormous amount of curiosity, and she looked at Silas with both eyebrows raised and a smile that was asking a very specific question. Maude introduced him as a man who had been working the Phelps place and was neighborly, and Ruth had said, "Is he?" in the tone of someone filing information for future use. Frank Calloway shook Silas's hand and said there was a town meeting in Harlan Creek on Wednesday to discuss the cattle company that had been pressuring homesteaders on the southwest quarter, and did Silas know about it? Silas said he had heard something. Frank said that whoever was camping near Maude's property ought to know, because the cattle company had been known to make noise at night near claims they were trying to discourage. Silas looked at Frank Calloway steadily and said that he would be at the meeting. He attended the meeting in Harlan Creek that Wednesday, which was a small town of perhaps 300 souls with a dry goods store, a smithy, a post office that also served as the land office annex, a church that was still being painted, and a saloon called the Red Lantern that had been there longer than everything else. The meeting was in the church, and roughly 30 homesteaders crowded into pews that had been built for 20. Maude was there, sitting 3 rows from the front next to Ruth Calloway, and when Silas came in she moved slightly, just slightly, and he understood the invitation and sat beside her. The meeting concerned a cattle company out of Wichita that had been using a legal gray area to challenge homestead claims on land adjacent to old grazing corridors. They had a lawyer, and several of the smaller homesteaders did not. A man named Aldous Ketterman, who ran the dry goods store and apparently served as the community's unofficial legal mind due to having read more than anyone else, explained the situation with clarity. The company's position was arguable but not airtight. What the homesteaders needed was to ensure their claims were filed properly and completely, with documented improvements, because the Homestead Act required proof of improvement and cultivation, and the company's lawyer was arguing that several of the claims showed insufficient evidence. Maude asked 3 precise questions, one about the documentation required, one about the timeline for challenge and response, and one about whether a woman's claim stood on the same legal footing as a man's under the current statutes. That last question was answered by Ketterman with visible discomfort, and his answer was that technically yes, but that in practice it was more complicated, and Maude said, "Then I will make sure my documentation is better than anyone else's," and said no more about it. Silas found himself watching her from the corner of his eye and thinking that she was the most capable and self-possessed person in the room, and that the room included several men twice her age. They walked out of the meeting together and stood in the last of the evening light on the hard-packed dirt street, and she said, without looking at him, "You have been camping near my place for some time now." He said, "I have." She said, "You don't have to, you know, I am managing." "I know you are," he said. "That has nothing to do with it." She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment the lamplight from the Red Lantern fell across her face in a way that made her look, just for a breath, like something out of a painting, except more real than any painting. Then she said, "What does it have to do with, then?" He was honest because she was the kind of person who deserved honesty. He said, "I would rather be near your property than anywhere else I could think of to be. I'm aware that sounds peculiar," she said. "It doesn't sound peculiar." She looked at him then, directly, the way she always looked at things. "It sounds like something I should be careful with." "You should be careful with it," he said. "I'm not asking for anything." She studied him for another moment and then she said, "I know you're not," and something in those 4 words told him that she had noticed this, that he had not pushed, and that it had not gone unregistered. They rode back to their respective properties in companionable parallel, and where the road forked he went one way and she went the other, and he sat on his horse at the fork for a moment watching her ride home, and he thought to himself, clearly and without sentiment, that he was completely lost on this woman, and had been since the day she was arguing with a ridgepole. He moved camp again 2 weeks later. He had a reason this time that was not entirely invented. He found sign of a cattle drive cutting through the northwest corner of her property, which was technically trespassing, and the nearest point from which he could monitor the situation without looking like he was crowding her was a rise about 2 miles north of the soddy, near a stand of cottonwood trees that offered shade and decent sightlines. He set his camp there, dug a proper fire ring, staked Ramai in good grass, and stretched his canvas between 2 of the largest cottonwoods. It was, he had to admit to himself while he drove the tent stakes, not entirely unlike what a man who was building up to something might do. He spent those weeks working. He had picked up a route delivering supplies for the Harlan Creek dry goods store, riding out to the 3 or 4 most remote homesteads twice a week with flour and salt, and whatever else Ketterman needed moved, and it paid well enough and it kept him in the county. He stopped at Maude's place when the route allowed it, which was often, and sometimes she fed him supper, and sometimes she did not, and either way was fine. In those suppers, when they happened, he learned her. He learned that she had grown up in Ohio, daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Maude was 12, and that she had taken over the keeping of the house from that age onward, which explained her competence with practical things. He learned that she and Thomas Gentry had been married 3 years, and that she had loved him in a steady, domestic way that she described with gentle honesty as good, and that his death had been a grief she had made her way through by moving forward because standing still felt like drowning. He learned that she had read everything she could find about dryland farming before coming to Kansas, that she had a copy of a farming almanac so annotated in her own small handwriting that the margins were barely visible anymore. She learned him in return because she was fair that way. She asked careful questions and listened to the answers with her full attention, and he found himself saying things he had not said to anyone in some time, about his parents' farm in Missouri that had been destroyed in the war when he was a child, about the years after that were hand to mouth and moving, about how he had drifted into ranch work because it was work and it was outside, and it let him keep moving so he did not have to think too hard about the fact that he had nowhere to go back to. He said this last part more honestly than he intended, and she looked at him across her table with something in her eyes that was neither pity nor judgment but something warmer and more particular, and she said, "Well, you seem like a man who is good at building things. Maybe that means something." He took that home with him and turned it over in his mind for a long time. On a Thursday in late June, the cattle company's man came to Maude's homestead. Silas was not there when it happened, but he arrived at her place an hour later with the dry goods delivery and found her standing on her step with a document in her hand and a look on her face that was controlled fury, the kind of fury that is more dangerous than the shouted kind. She handed him the document without speaking. It was a formal notice claiming her southwest quarter was disputed due to an alleged improvement deficiency, signed by an attorney named Whitmore on behalf of the Wichita Grazing Consortium. Silas read it twice. He said, "This is nonsense." "It is," she said, "but legal nonsense requires a legal answer." He said, "Ketterman." "I'm riding in tomorrow," she said. "I have my documentation. I've been keeping a record since I filed. Measurements, dates, improvements made, witness signatures when anyone was present. I thought I might need it." He thought about the annotated almanac, about the way she had asked those precise questions at the church meeting, and he understood that she had been preparing for this since the beginning. "Good," he said. Then she said very quietly, "I am angry." "You have every right to be," he said. "I am angry because they would not have done this to Thomas," she said, "or not as easily. They see a woman alone and they think there is less resistance." He held this with her for a moment, the injustice of it that was real and specific and infuriating. Then he said, "Will you let me come with you tomorrow, not to speak for you, just to be there?" She looked at him and said, "Yes." They rode into Harlan Creek together the next morning, and Ketterman reviewed her documentation with growing respect in his expression, and he said that her records were better than any he had seen, and that the company's challenge would not stand if they brought this to the county judge. He wrote letters that needed writing. Silas sat in the corner of the store and said nothing and drank bad coffee and was simply there in the room in the way that he was learning was what he could offer. On the ride home, she said, "You are different from what I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" She said, "When I first saw you at my camp, I expected the usual. A drifter who would offer to help and then consider himself owed something." "I can see why you would expect that," he said. "You never acted that way," she said. "No," he said. "Why not?" she asked, and the question was direct and genuine and deserved the same. He thought about how to say it truly. He said, "Because what I felt wasn't that kind. It was the kind that means you want things to go well for someone, not just for yourself. I couldn't explain it except to say it was there from the beginning, and it wasn't the kind I could be casual about." She was quiet for a long stretch of prairie, long enough that he thought he had said too much. Then she said, "I am not ready for anything. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." "Thomas has been gone 8 months," she said. "I am still finding the edges of what that means." "Take the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him then, and her eyes said something that her mouth was not yet prepared to say, and he received it carefully and did not press it. The summer came on fully, and the grass went tall and the heat settled over the Kansas plains with the comfortable weight of a thing that belongs there. Maude's crops came in better than she had hoped. Her corn was strong and her kitchen garden was producing, and she had traded with Ruth Calloway for a pair of laying hens that lived in a small pen behind the soddy and provided eggs with reliable cheerfulness. The cattle company backed down. The county judge reviewed the documentation and found the challenge without merit, and the letter from Ketterman was formal and definitive, and Maude read it at her table and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and held. She folded the letter and put it in her records box and said, "Good." And then she said, "I'd like to celebrate somehow, only I don't have anything to celebrate with." Silas said, "I have a bottle of apple brandy I have been saving for no particular reason." She said, "That's a particular reason enough." They sat outside her soddy that evening in the long summer dusk with the brandy between them and the sound of the grasshoppers, and the distant lowing of the Phelps cattle, and the whole wide Kansas sky going orange and purple overhead, and they talked for 3 hours without noticing the time passing, and somewhere in the middle of it the conversation had shifted from practical things to something else, the kind of talk that belongs to the particular late hour when guards have been set aside. She told him about the night Thomas died, about sitting by his bed in the hotel in St. Louis where they had stopped because he was too sick to travel, about the moment when the doctor came in, and she understood from the set of his shoulders before he spoke what he was going to say. She told this with steady eyes and a steady voice, and he understood that she had told it to herself many times already, and that saying it to him was different, was a giving of it to someone else, and he received it solemnly. He told her about the farm in Missouri, the before and the after. The before had been a warm and solid thing, and the after had been cold and full of motion, because motion had been the only answer available to a 9-year-old, whose father had not come back from a war and whose mother had worked herself to a hollow by the time he was 15. He had not told this to many people. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened, with her full self. When the bottle was done and the stars were properly installed above them, they sat without talking for a while, and it was easy in the way that silence with a person can only be if something real has been established between them. He moved camp closer to her homestead the following week. He told himself he had reasons, because he always told himself he had reasons, but the truth was that 2 miles felt like too much distance now, and 1 mile felt more honest. He settled his camp on a low rise directly north of her property, close enough to see her morning smoke without any strain, close enough to hear, on a still night, if anything was wrong. He dug a good fire ring and cut fresh stakes and stretched the canvas between a pair of younger cottonwoods, and he acknowledged to himself, this time without any pretense, that what he was doing was exactly what a man did when a specific woman had become the fixed point by which he navigated. Phelps noticed. The rancher was riding his own fence line one afternoon when he stopped and looked at Silas's camp with the shrewdness of a man who had watched many things happen on the prairie over many years. He said, "You sparking the Gentry widow Brooks," Silas said. "I respect Mrs. Gentry considerably." Phelps looked at him for a long moment and then laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Fair enough," and rode on. Ruth Calloway noticed and said quite a lot more. She arrived at Maude's homestead on a Tuesday with a pie and a great deal of opinions, and Silas happened to be there fixing the gate to the chicken pen, which he had noticed was about to fail, and Ruth looked at the gate repair and then at Maude and then at Silas with an expression of enormous satisfaction and said, "Well, this is a tidy situation." Maude said, "He's fixing the gate, Ruth." Ruth said, "He certainly is," in a tone that indicated she was not talking about the gate. Maude caught Silas's eye over Ruth's head, and the expression on her face was simultaneously irritated and faintly amused, and he looked away quickly because smiling seemed like the wrong thing to do even though he very much wanted to. After Ruth left, Maude stood beside him while he finished the gate latch, and she said, without any particular lead-up, "People are going to make assumptions." He said, "I expect they will," she said. "Does that bother you?" He looked at her. He said, "Number should it." She considered this, smoothing her apron with both hands in a gesture he had come to recognize as the thing she did when she was thinking something through. "Suppose," she said slowly, "that it would only bother me if it were wrong." He said nothing because the sentence could go several ways and he was not going to assume the one he wanted. She said, "I don't know that it's wrong." The quality of the air between them changed slightly, the way air does before weather a new charge in it. He set down the pliers he had been holding and gave her his full attention because this deserved it. "Maude," he said. "I know," she said quickly, "that I said I needed time, and I did. I do, I just want you to know that the time is becoming less rather than more." He said, "That's enough for me." She nodded once, as though something had been agreed on, and then she picked up the egg basket she had set down when Ruth arrived and went back to the chicken pen, and he watched her go with a feeling in his chest that was half ache and half something close to joy, and he went back to fixing the gate. August came in like a furnace door opening, and the work of the homestead was relentless. Maude's corn needed harvesting, and the root vegetables needed pulling and putting up, and the soddy needed various small repairs before the autumn, and she did all of this with her characteristic focus and efficiency. Silas helped where he was invited and stayed out of it where he was not. He continued his delivery route. He did work for Phelps when Phelps needed it. He was a man with an occupation and a life, not a man loitering on someone else's property, and the distinction mattered to him, and he thought to her. But the fabric of their days had woven together in a way that was now simply how things were. He came to her well each morning because his camp's water source was less reliable, and this was true. She had begun, quietly, to cook enough supper for two when she thought he might stop by, and she had done this without announcing it. Simply put 2 tin plates on the table on certain evenings, and the first time he had noticed he had said nothing about it, and she had not commented on it, and they had both tacitly agreed that this was now a thing that happened. One evening in mid-August she was sitting at her table after supper working on the repair of a boot sole with an awl and heavy thread, the lamplight making her face soft and focused, and he was across the table doing nothing useful except being there, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you ever think about what this place will look like in 10 years, what you want it to be?" She set down the boot and thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. She said, "I think about a proper house, wood frame, not sod, a real kitchen, a larger garden, maybe an apple tree, though I know they take years." She paused. "I think about it not being so quiet, maybe." He said carefully, "Not quiet in which way?" She looked at him across the lamp. She said, "In the way that one person in a house is quiet." He held this. He said, "Maude," she said, "I know what I'm saying." He said, "I want to be sure we both know." She stood up from the table and carried her lamp to the sideboard and stood with her back to him for a moment, and he could see her deciding something. When she turned around, she had the look of a woman who had made up her mind about a thing and was not going to unmake it. She said, "You have been the steadiest, most decent presence in my life for 4 months. You have not pushed or crowded me or made me feel like anything you offered had a price on it. I notice what you do, Silas. I notice that you see what needs doing, and you do it without being asked. I notice that you listen to me like I am actually saying something worth hearing. I notice that every week you have made yourself a little closer, not because you are pressing me but because you don't want to be far, and I notice that I have not wanted you to be far either." He was standing by now. He said, "What does that mean for you?" She said, "It means I think I am in love with you, which frightens me considerably, but there it is." He crossed the room in 3 steps and stopped in front of her, close but not touching because she had been through too much to be grabbed at. He said, I have loved you since you were fighting a ridgepole. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. She said, that was a terrible introduction. It was the best introduction I ever had, he said. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he put his hand over hers, and they stayed like that for a moment that was entirely sufficient, and then she said, well then. And he kissed her, carefully and entirely, and she kissed him back with the warmth of someone who has been cold for a long time and has finally come inside. After that evening, the thing between them was named. It had been real before the naming, but the naming made it solid in a different way. The way that building a wall from materials that are already there makes something that was possible into something that actually stands. He moved camp again at the end of August to the half-mile mark from her property line, and this time he did not invent reasons for it. He simply moved, and she knew why, and when he told her that night where he had set up, she said, "You are getting closer," with a particular quality in her voice that was warm and specific and meant for him. He said, "I thought you might have noticed." She said, "I noticed from the first week." He said, "And you didn't say anything to discourage it." She said, "No." A pause. "I didn't." September brought the first coolness in the air, and with it the particular clarity of prairie autumn, where the light goes golden and slant, and everything feels both more itself and more temporary. Silas had a conversation with himself that he had been working up to for some time, and that was now simply overdue. He went to Ketterman's store on a Tuesday morning and asked if the man knew anything about the legal requirements for marriage in Harlan Creek County, and Ketterman, who clearly knew exactly what was being asked and why, provided the information with businesslike efficiency and only a small amount of visible satisfaction. He rode back to his camp and sat by his fire and thought about how to do this correctly. He had no family money and no land of his own, but he had skills and health and willingness to work any honest job, and he had 4 months of delivery income saved, and he had something more important, which was the complete and unequivocal certainty that Maude Gentry was the person he wanted to build a life alongside. He did not think this was a small thing to offer. He thought it was the only thing that mattered. He also thought about her homestead, about the fact that the land was hers, her claim, her labor, her future, and that any conversation about their future together had to be a conversation about her land staying exactly what it was, hers, in law and in practice, because she had fought for it and earned it, and he would not for anything be the reason she lost the thing she had come to Kansas to have. He arrived at her homestead on a Friday evening in the 3rd week of September with his horse groomed and his shirt clean and his boots, which never entirely lost the red Kansas dust, at least making an effort. She was putting up the last of the root vegetables, kneeling in the garden with her hands in the earth, and she looked up when Remai's hooves sounded on the hard ground, and she saw something in his face, and she stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She said, "You have a look about you." He said, "I suppose I do." She said, "Is something wrong?" He said, "No, nothing is wrong." He dismounted and tied Remai and turned to face her. The evening light was doing the amber thing it did in September on the Kansas plain, where everything looked like the inside of a lamp. She was beautiful in the real and specific way that she had always been, which had nothing to do with the light and everything to do with who she was, the gravity and the directness and the warmth she let out slowly, like heat from a good stone. He said, "Maude, I want to ask you something, and before I do I want to say something first." She said, "All right." He said, "I want you to know that your land is yours. Whatever I'm asking, that's not conditional on anything. It is yours by your right and your work, and I am not asking for anything that changes that. I want you to know that I understand you are not a woman who needs saving, and I don't intend to be someone who tries to save you. What I am is a man who would like to spend his life working alongside someone he admires and loves, and that is the whole of it." She was very still. She said, "Say the rest." He said, "Will you marry me?" She was quiet for a moment, but it was not the quiet of someone deciding. It was the quiet of someone who has already decided and is simply feeling the weight of the moment. Then she said, "Yes." simply and without decoration, which was entirely like her. He stepped toward her and she met him in the middle, and when he kissed her, the evening light and the grasshopper sound and the smell of turned earth and autumn prairie were all part of it, and they stood like that for a long time in the middle of the garden she had planted with her own hands. They were married in the Harlan Creek Church on the 15th of October, 1874, on a morning when the sky was the specific blue that October does on the plains, hard and clear and very high. Ruth Calloway stood up for Maude and wept with uncomplicated happiness. Frank Calloway stood up for Silas and shook his hand with the grip of a man who approved thoroughly. Ketterman from the dry goods store read the psalm because the preacher was stuck on the road from Wichita, and Ketterman had the best reading voice in the county anyway. There were perhaps 20 people from the homesteads around Harlan Creek, because word traveled in a community that was building itself out of nothing, and a wedding was a thing worth celebrating. Maude wore a dress she had made over the summer from indigo calico that she had ordered from the dry goods store back in July, which Silas had thought nothing of at the time, and now understood with a start she had made it in anticipation of exactly this event, which told him that she had known longer than he had known. When he said this to her afterward, she said, "I knew something. I wasn't certain what yet," with the small particular smile that was his favorite thing in the world. They walked out of the church together into the October sunlight, and Ruth threw dried flower petals from her garden, and the children she had brought ran in circles, and Frank shook Silas's hand again, and Ketterman said the food at his store was on him today, which was generous, and all of Harlan Creek stood around in the autumn light being warm. After they rode home together to the homestead, and Silas had moved his remaining things from the camp in the cottonwoods that morning, so there was no longer a camp, only a house. Maude's house. Their house now, in the way that matters, which is not on a deed, but in the daily reality of waking up in the same place. He had brought his tools and his rifle and his skillet and his bedroll, and the small box that held his one photograph of his mother and the jackknife that had been his father's, and he had arranged none of these things yet, because it was not his place to arrange them without her. And when she saw this, his things sitting in a careful pile in the corner, she understood it immediately and said nothing about it but squeezed his hand once. The winter came in November with authority, and they learned each other in the way that only living together teaches a person about another person. He learned that she woke early and thought for a full half-hour before she spoke to anyone, and that this was not coldness but a necessary interior process, and he gave her the mornings. She learned that he had no sense of when food was burning unless it burned completely, and she developed a system of checking the cookstove at intervals when he was in charge of supper. He learned that she kept her grief for Thomas in a small and private place and visited it occasionally, and that this was honest and right and not a door he needed to open, only to respect. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, old war-child nightmares, and that the thing that helped was simply her hand on his shoulder, which she gave without making a production of it, which was the correct and generous way to help. They talked. They talked for hours on winter evenings when the wind came over the flat land, and the soddy was warm and the lamp was good. And the talking was the kind that builds something, not just occupying sound, but actually saying things. He told her everything eventually, all the pieces he had kept separate, and she received them and put them together into the whole person she had been assembling since the first day, and he felt, for the first time in many years, the particular relief of being entirely known. She told him everything too, and he held her history with the same care with which she held his. By the deep cold of January they had developed the ease of people who fit together in the particular way that is not sameness but complementary difference, where each person's particular strengths cover the places where the other has a gap. He was patient and she was precise. She planned and he adapted. He was good with animals and she was good with numbers. He would rather work outside until dark, and she would rather stop an hour before dark to make sure the evening was done properly, and both approaches were right depending on the day. On a February night when the snow was against the door and the fire was high and they were side by side on the bench reading. She, the almanac and a seed catalog that had arrived from a company in Illinois. He, a history of Kansas settlement that Ketterman had lent him. She said, without looking up from the catalog, "I have been thinking about spring planting. I want to add a wheat section if we can prepare the ground." He said, "East of the garden or north?" She said, "East. The light is better." He said, "We can break the sod in April when it softens." She said, "Yes." Then, after a pause, "I've been thinking about other things too." He looked up from the history. She was looking at the seed catalog still, and there was something in the line of her shoulders that told him this was a careful sentence. He waited. She said, "About whether the soddy will be large enough eventually." He said slowly, with a full understanding of what she was saying, "That depends on what we eventually means." She looked at him then directly with those gray eyes. She said, "I think I may be expecting." He set down the history book. He looked at her, at the careful composure of her face and the warmth that had come into her eyes, and he said, "Maude," she said, "I'm not certain yet, but I think so." He moved from his side of the bench to her side, which required some maneuvering in the small space, and he put his arms around her, and she let herself lean against him in the way she had learned to do, which was not natural for her but was becoming more so. He said, "How do you feel?" She said, frightened and pleased both at once. He said, "That seems about right." She said, "We will need to plan carefully." He said, "We will." She said, "The house first before winter again." He said, "Absolutely, the house first. I can start planning the frame after planting is done. Phelps told me there's a lumber mill open near Abilene now." She said, "I know. I wrote to them for prices last month." He laughed, which was the right thing to do. He said, "Of course you did." She said, with a smile against his shoulder, "Someone has to." Spring came back to Kansas in 1875, the way it always did on the flat land. Not gradually, but all at once, as though the prairie had been waiting and then simply decided. The snow went in a week, and the ground softened and the grass began its return, and the whole great plain went green gold in a way that made Silas stop sometimes just to look at it, because it was the landscape of his life now, and he had not expected to love a landscape before, and was surprised to find that he did. They broke the east field in April, both of them working the mule that Maude had now purchased outright with her winter egg sales, and some money from the hay she had sold to Phelps in the fall. The ground fighting them, and them fighting the ground, and by the end of each day they were both so tired that supper was eaten mostly in silence and sleep was immediate. But the field expanded every day, and the satisfaction of it was specific and deep. Maude was very clearly expecting by May, her belly a fact that she neither concealed nor made much of, simply carrying it along with everything else she carried. She had written to a woman in Harlan Creek who had experience as a midwife, a quiet, steady woman named Mrs. Elspeth Hare, who came to call in June and said that Maude was in good health and the baby was well positioned, and that she expected a straightforward birth in early October. Silas had started on the house in June, framing out the ground plan on the east side of the soddy, so that they could continue living in the soddy while the new structure went up. He had the lumber from Abilene, hauled in on a borrowed wagon, and he had Frank Calloway for 4 days and 2 men from further along the road who came in exchange for a promise of help with their own projects. The framing went up quickly. The walls took longer. By August the structure was weather-tight, and by September, with considerable urgency given the timing, the interior was finished to the point of livability. They moved their things in on a Sunday in late September, 2 weeks before Mrs. Hare said the baby would likely come. The house was not finished. The floors were wide plank that needed proper sealing, and the walls were bare wood that Maude planned to whitewash, and the kitchen area was functional but still missing its full shelf set, but it stood upright and smelled of new lumber and had 2 rooms and a proper hearth. And when Maude walked through the door, she stood in the middle of the main room and was quiet for a moment. He said, "Is it what you imagined?" She said, "It's better. Then it's mine." He said, "It's ours." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that she did not usually permit, and she said, "You know what I mean. You understand that when I say mine it includes you," he said. "I do," she said. "Good." She touched the wall with one hand, the new wood, the solid standing fact of it, and he watched her and felt the fullness of being exactly where he was supposed to be. James Thomas Brooks was born on the 8th of October, 1875, in the new house, with Mrs. Hare steady and competent and Silas pacing the yard outside in the chill October dark, until Frank Calloway, who had come with Ruth, told him firmly to sit down before he wore a channel in the earth. When the sound came from inside, the particular first sound of a new person arriving in the world, he stopped breathing entirely until Mrs. Hare opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Brooks, and your wife is well," and he went in and saw Maude sitting up in the bed looking exhausted and complete, holding the smallest and most outraged human being he had ever seen, and his eyes went wet in a way he would have been embarrassed about if he had had any attention to spare for embarrassment. Maude looked at him over the baby's head and said, "He has your coloring." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at his wife, and said nothing for a long time because there was nothing sufficient. She said, "James, I thought, James Thomas. Is that all right?" he said. "It's perfect." James Thomas was a loud and opinionated infant with dark hair and gray eyes that could not decide whose they were, and a temperament that announced itself firmly in the early weeks. Silas had not spent much time around babies, and found himself learning with the same attention he gave to anything he wanted to do properly, which meant asking questions, watching what Maude did, and making a considerable number of errors that she corrected without making him feel worse about them than was necessary. Ruth Calloway came regularly in the first months and was invaluable, and Maude received this help more gracefully than she received most help, which told Silas that she had learned, or was learning, that the homesteaders of this part of Kansas were a community, and that community was one of the things she had come here to have. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was a thing they survived together, all three of them in the new house with the hearth doing its job, and the wood stack that Silas had built high enough to last, and the baby growing steadily from a thing that only cried and ate into a thing that also occasionally looked at them with apparent recognition, which was astonishing every time. In the spring of 1876, the wheat they planted in the east field came in well, and the garden was larger than the previous year, and Maude had added a hen house properly built rather than the pen they had started with, and there were now 6 hens, and a rooster named Garrison who took his responsibilities very seriously. Silas had added a small barn for Remai and the mule, and a second stall for the milk cow they bought in March from a family moving further west. The homestead was becoming something that looked like what it had been in planning, a working farm, a place that was producing its own life. James learned to sit up in the summer of 1876, and to pull himself toward things he wanted, and to look at his father when Silas came in at the end of a day with the expression of someone greeting a known and welcome thing. Silas, who had not known he was the kind of man to be moved by a baby's face, discovered that he was entirely that kind of man. He and Maude had settled into a rhythm of days that was neither monotonous nor dramatic, but was simply the texture of a life that was being built. They argued sometimes because they were both opinionated and direct and lived in close quarters, and the arguments were usually about practical things, how to address a problem with the east fence, whether to sell grain now or hold it for a better price, whether the second room needed to be finished before winter, or whether the money was better spent on seed. These arguments were conducted with the directness they had both been born with and resolved with the good will that had developed between them, and neither of them carried grudges, which was possibly the most useful quality either of them had. In the evenings, after James was sleeping and the chores were done and the supper dishes were cleared, they sat together in the way that had begun the first evening of the previous winter and continued unchanged, reading or talking or sometimes just sitting in companionable quiet with the lamp between them and the nighttime prairie sounds outside. And Silas thought sometimes about the camp 5 miles from her homestead, and then 4 miles, and then 3, and then the cottonwood rise a mile away, and then the half-mile. And then this chair in this room beside this woman, and he thought that every step of it had been the exact right distance. In the summer of 1877, Maude told him, on a June evening with the window open and the warm air coming in, that James was going to have a sibling. She told him with the confidence of a woman who had done this before and knew what she was dealing with, and he received the news with the joy that was becoming familiar, a specific fullness that he associated entirely with this woman and this life. This second child came in January of 1878, another January morning with the snow against the windows, and was a daughter, small and furious in the same way James had been furious, with her mother's gray eyes already showing in the first weeks. They named her Clara Jane, and James, who was 2.5 and very interested in his opinions about everything, regarded her with the grave suspicion of a person whose position has been slightly altered by someone else's arrival. By the spring of 1878, the homestead was a full and working place. The house had been properly finished, the walls whitewashed as Maude had planned, the floors sealed, a proper shelf set in the kitchen. The wheat field had expanded. They had 2 cows now, and a larger flock of chickens, and a kitchen garden that Maude managed with the same annotated precision she had applied to the farming almanac. Phelps had retired and his son, a more cooperative young man, had taken over the ranch, and the boundary questions had been settled amiably. James, who had his father's dark hair and his mother's direct gray eyes and the combined stubbornness of both parents, was learning to walk around the yard with great seriousness, stopping frequently to examine things that interested him, which was most things. Clara had Maude's precision and made her displeasure known with complete specificity, wailing at distinct problems rather than wailing generally, which Silas found oddly admirable. Ruth Calloway came to see the children one afternoon in April, and sat at Maude's kitchen table and drank coffee and looked around at the house, at the proper kitchen and the children and Silas's boots by the door and the coat he had hung on the peg and the particular settled lived-in look of a household that has been working for years, and she said, "Do you remember when I came to your soddy the first time and there was a man fixing your gate?" Maude said, "I remember." Ruth said, "I knew then." Maude said with a smile, "You didn't know anything." Ruth said, "I knew something." Maude looked at her with the particular expression she had for Ruth, which was fond and somewhat resigned. She said he was fixing the gate because it needed fixing. Ruth said, "He was fixing the gate because he couldn't stand to watch anything in your life be broken." Maude was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's also true." When Silas came in from the field that evening, his boots carrying the Kansas mud of a spring afternoon, and Maude handed him a towel, and he cleaned up at the basin, and James ran at his knees from across the room, and he caught the boy and spun him up to his shoulder. Maude stood in her kitchen in the house that was hers and theirs, and thought about the day a stranger had stopped on the road because she was fighting a ridgepole. And she thought about how a person's whole life can pivot on a single stopped horse and a direct question, and the willingness on both sides to be real rather than careful. She thought about Thomas, the good and steady man who had wanted this life with her and had not lived to have it. She thought about his face with a tenderness that time had made gentler rather than sharper. She thought that grief and love were not opponents, that she could carry both, that the Thomas-shaped place in her history was not a wound any more but simply a room, furnished and known and part of the house of who she was. She thought that he would have been glad for her, because he had been a good man who wanted good things for people. She thought that Silas Brooks was the most exactly right person for the life she was actually living. She handed him the second plate she had automatically prepared, the one that had started as hospitality and become habit and become love, and he set James down on the floor with a toy and took the plate with both hands, and he looked at her in the way he had always looked at her, fully and without reserve, and he said, "Good day," she said. "Yes." Ruth came. He said, "Ruth is always an event." She said, "She knew, apparently, about you, from the beginning." He said, "I expect half the county knew before I fully admitted it to myself." She said, "When did you fully admit it to yourself?" He thought about it honestly, in the way he thought about things she asked. He said, "When I moved camp to the Cottonwood Rise. That was when I stopped pretending." She said, "Why that time?" He said, "Because I was close enough to see your morning smoke without any effort, and I wanted to see your morning smoke. And I thought, a man who wants to see a woman's morning smoke is not a man who can call himself neutral on the subject." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind she gave openly now in a way she had not at the beginning, and the sound of it moved through the kitchen and mixed with the smell of supper cooking, and the sound of James on the floor talking to himself, and the softer sound of Clara sleeping in the other room. And Silas thought, as he sometimes thought when he was paying attention, that this was the specific shape of a good life, not abstract but particular, this kitchen and these sounds and this woman laughing. They ate supper together, the two of them and James, and after James was put to bed and Clara nursed and sleeping again, they sat in the main room by the lamp, Maude with her account book, which she kept with the same meticulous care she kept everything, and Silas with the Kansas newspaper that came weekly from Wichita. The wind was up outside, the spring prairie wind that never entirely stopped, but the house held against it solidly because it had been built solid, because they had built it to last. After a while he said, "I was thinking about adding a room for when they're older and need their own space." She looked up from the account book. She said, "The north side." He said, "That's what I was thinking." She said, "I thought the same." A pause. "There's budget for it if we wait until fall after the harvest comes in." He said, "Fall then." She went back to the account book and he went back to the newspaper, and the lamp held its pool of light around them, and the prairie wind went around the house, and the children were sleeping, and the year was 1878, and the homestead was fully real, a living thing, with roots in the Kansas earth, built from a woman's determination, and a man who could not stop moving closer. They would add the north room in the fall, as planned, and James would claim it with the authority of a firstborn, and Clara would follow him everywhere from the moment she could walk, which was earlier than expected and with great determination. Ruth Calloway would remain their closest neighbor and most reliable friend, and Frank would help with the harvest for years running, and they would help Frank in return, because that was the economy of the community they had built themselves into. Harlan Creek would grow, tentatively and with arguments and setbacks, into a proper small town with a schoolhouse built in 1879, and Maude would serve on the schoolhouse committee because she was the kind of person who made things work, and Silas would contribute the lumber work because he was the kind of person who showed up when showing up was needed. James would walk to that schoolhouse beginning at 5 years old, with his slate and his lunch wrapped in cloth, and Silas would watch him go with the particular feeling a father has when his child walks off into the future. Maude would plant her apple trees in the spring of 1879, 2 of them along the south side of the house, knowing they would take years. Silas would dig the holes without being asked because he had noticed the trees on the order she had placed at Ketterman's store and he knew what they were for. When he had the holes ready, she came out and saw them and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "You remembered." He said, "You said on our first winter evening that you wanted apple trees." She said, "That was 4 years ago." He said, "I have a good memory." She looked at him with the full attention of her gray eyes and said, "Yes, you do." And the words meant something beyond apple trees, meant that she understood he had been listening to her, all of it, from the beginning, storing everything she said as though it mattered. The apple trees would eventually produce, as apple trees do in their own time, and by the middle years of the 1880s, there would be fruit from them every autumn, And Maude would make preserves from the apples and remember being 24 and reading the almanac by lamplight in an Ohio room, and writing down everything she needed to know before she set out for Kansas. But this evening in 1878, they were only trees being planted, and the last light was going gold, and James was asleep, and Clara was making the small sounds that meant she would be awake soon, and Maude and Silas stood beside the newly planted apple saplings in the spring evening, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and she said, "What were you when I first saw you? Just a man on a horse." He said, "Just a man on a horse." She said, "You could have ridden on." He said, "I couldn't," she said. "You stopped for a ridgepole." He said, "I stopped for you." The ridgepole was beside the point. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the small saplings in the Kansas evening light, the long grass moving beyond the fence line, the wide sky doing what it always did, being enormous and unconcerned and full of weather. Then she said, "I am glad you kept moving closer." He said, "I could not have done otherwise." She said, "I know." She looked up at him. "I think I knew that early, that you were the kind of man who would not stop halfway, that whatever you were doing, you would see it through." He said, "And is that what you wanted? Someone who wouldn't stop?" She considered it in her honest way, the way she considered everything that deserved a real answer. She said, "I didn't know I wanted it. I thought I didn't want anyone at all for a long time, but what I discovered was that the right kind of presence is not a burden, it's a gift. You were never there in a way that asked anything of me. You were just there, and the being there was the whole of it." He said, "That's the whole of it still." She said, "Yes." Clara made a more insistent sound from inside the house, and Maude moved to go in, and Silas followed. And the door of the house closed behind them, and the lamp was lit inside, and the two apple trees stood in the last of the evening, small and new, and given toward the future. The years built on themselves the way years do when the foundation is good. They were not always easy years. The drought of 1880 was hard and required careful rationing and creative farming and borrowing between neighbors in the way that hard times create. Silas took extra work where he could find it without apology, and Maude managed the household accounts through it with a precision that saved them more than once, and they came through it together without bitterness, which was the measure of a thing. James grew into a boy of considerable energy, and his father's patience in some things, and his mother's precision in others, and a stubbornness that was entirely his own. Clara grew into a girl who noticed everything and said exactly what she thought about it, which was familiar. By 1882 they were both in school, and the house was both quieter during the days and somehow fuller in the evenings. Silas had stopped drifting long ago in any practical sense, but the year he fully stopped thinking of himself as a drifter, as a man in passage, was not the year he married Maude or the year James was born. It was a morning in 1882 when he walked out of the house before breakfast to check the east field, and the morning light was on the wheat, and the house was behind him, and the smoke was starting from the kitchen chimney, and he could hear just Maude's voice inside, talking to the children in the particular tone she used when she was explaining something, and he stood in the field and understood that this was not a place he had arrived at. This was a place he had made. With his hands in her hands, with 4 years of daily work and disagreement and love, they had made something out of 160 acres of flat Kansas ground, and a woman on a roof arguing with a ridgepole and a man who found he could not ride past. He stood in the morning light for a moment longer, the wheat around his knees, the sky doing what Kansas skies do, which is be too large for any single person to be adequately prepared for, and he thought that there was nowhere else in the world he could imagine being, and that this was not a lack of imagination, but the precise opposite, that imagining clearly had led him exactly here. He went back inside and sat down at the table, and Maude put coffee in front of him without being asked, and James asked him something about the field, and Clara showed him a drawing she had done at school, and the morning went on in the particular and unremarkable and beautiful way that mornings in a family go, full of small commerce and warm noise, and the certainty of being in a place that holds you. and Silas Brooks, who had owned a horse and a rifle and a skillet, and not much else of consequence the spring he first stopped on a road and forgot where he was going, sat at the table in the house he had built. Beside the woman he had loved from the moment she directed full gray eyes at him from a rooftop. Across from the children who were the living evidence that love and time and good Kansas earth could produce something lasting. And he thought that the best decision he had ever made was the one he had not entirely made consciously, the one that had just happened, the slow and steady moving of a camp 1 week at a time from 5 miles to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 to half to finally, inevitably, the knocking on the door. He had knocked on the door. She had opened it. Everything since then had been home.